Hi, welcome to Basic Math. Today we're going to be looking some more at fractions. We're going to be looking at we're going to be getting ready to, add and subtract them. To add and subtract fractions, we're going to need to have what's called a common denominator. Basically, the denominators have to be the same or you can't add. So in this video, we're going to look at how you find that common denominator. So finding a least common denominator. Hereafter, we will refer to that as an LCD because I don't want to keep writing all that out. All right, so the least common denominator is the smallest number that is divisible by all of your denominators. So we have to be a little bit careful of that. I have an example and we're going to talk about it. So here's my example. I have two fractions, 3/4 and 1/8. The common denominator here is 8. 8 is a number that is divisible by 4. 8 is divisible by 8. We want to be a little bit careful. Sometimes people will tell me the common denominator is something like 2 or 4 because 2 goes into 4 and 2 goes into 8, which is true, but it's backwards. We want to make sure that our denominator, the one we find, is divisible by everything that we have, okay, not the other way around. So we're going to look at three basic methods of finding a common denominator here. We're going to look at the inspection method, we're going to look at multiplying the denominators together, and finally we'll look at factor trees, and then I'm going to leave it to you to decide which method works best for you. Here's a hint. Sometimes different methods work better than others. So it's going to be in your best interest to at least know how to do a couple of these. All right, so let's get some more stuff about them on the board. Okay, so our first method for finding a least common denominator is the inspection method. Basically, this method, you're just going to stare at the fractions until you figure out what they are both divisible, or what would be divisible by both of them, or all three if you have more than two fractions. So this is really just a stare at it and think about it method. It works really well if you have small numbers for your denominators. If you have big numbers for your denominators, this is not a great method because you're just going to stare at it and never figure it out. But it does work really well with small numbers. So, two examples. 3/5 and 1/2. So I need a number that's divisible by both 5 and 2. In this case, that number is 10. You literally just stare at it until you go, what would be divisible by both 5 and 2? In this case, 5 times 2 is 10, so that worked. And we'll actually look at multiplying the denominators together here shortly. So 10 is my common denominator. And again, I just got it by looking at the numbers and saying, what would be divisible by 5 and 2? The next one, I have 6 and 9. This time my least common denominator is 18. Notice 6 times 9 would be 54, which is quite a bit bigger than 18, so multiplying here wouldn't be a great option. But again, I'm just asking myself, what could I divide by 6 and also by 9? Okay, in this case, it's 18. So this is the inspection method. You just kind of stare at it until you figure it out. It's really quick if you can see it. And if you can't, it's not a great method. So then you want to have something else in your tool bag. So let's get to option number 2. Okay, our second method of finding a common denominator is to just multiply our denominators together. Now, this is super easy. If you have a calculator, you can use your calculator and just multiply those numbers together no matter how big they are. However, it doesn't necessarily find the least common denominator. Now, that's not really that big of a problem. You're going to get fractions that are bigger looking than they need to be, and you'll have to do more reducing. Okay, but if you're comfortable with reducing, this is probably one of the easiest methods we have for getting that common denominator, because every time you do the exact same thing, you just take those denominators and you multiply them together. So I have a couple of examples that we're going to look at, and I'm going to show you, that multiplying them together to find the common denominator, but I'm also going to show you maybe that it could have been better. And so it's not perfect, but it is a really good and easy to use method. All right, so here we go. 3/4 and 1/2. For my common denominator, I just took 4 times 2 and got 8. It is worth pointing out, though, that here the least common denominator would have been 4. Okay, so again, if you were to choose to use 8, if this were an addition problem, and you were choosing to use 8, you would have more reducing to do at the end of the problem. My second one, 5/8 and 9/10. Again, I just steal the 8 and the 10. 8 times 10 is 80. This time, the least common denominator was actually 40. But again, maybe that's a trade-off you're okay with. You're like, you know what? I just want to get my fractions added together or subtracted or whatever it is that we're doing with them. Just give me a common denominator and I'll be happy. So it's really kind of a little bit up to you. This is a very solid method, but you're going to get bigger fractions than you necessarily need, which will just mean you have to reduce more. So if you're okay with that, that's not a problem. Where this method really breaks down is if your denominators get really big, it can be very hard to reduce the answers if you're adding or subtracting. All right, so let's look at one more method. All right, our last method for finding a common denominator is to use what are called factor trees. So hopefully you have a little bit of experience with factor trees. If not, I'm going to show you a couple of them here, and I'll do another example on the next board too. For the factor trees method, we want to first make a factor tree for each of our denominators, and then use the most of each factor. What we're going to do is we're going to multiply them together. The factors, not the actual denominators. All right, so let's take a look. Here I have my fractions, 1/15 and 7/25. So to start, I made factor trees for both of my denominators. Now, a factor tree is where you take the number and you split it up into two numbers that multiply together to be, in this case, 15. So for 15, the only two things that multiply together to be 15 are 3 and 5. And so you can see down here, I wrote that out, 15 is just 3 times 5. 25 is 5 times 5, and I wrote that down here. And that's all it means to make a factor tree. If these two numbers multiply to be the number up above, then you're all set. Now, we want to use the most of each factor. So this is where it gets just a little bit tricky sometimes. We want to be careful. We don't want to use more than we need. All right, so when I look at these two factorizations, 15 has a 3 and a 5, 25 has two 5s. The only numbers I'm going to need to build my common denominator are 3 and 5. The only question is, how many do I need? So it says to use the most of each. Well, there's only one 3, right? 15 has a 3, 25 doesn't have any of them. The most 3s we have is just 1. The trickier bit is really the 5s here. Everybody wants to use all 3 5s, right? There's one there, one for the 15 and 2 for the 25. But remember, the directions say to use the most. So what's more, 1 or 2? Well, hopefully it's pretty obviously 2. So I'm only going to use 2 5s. Okay, I'm really not even using this third 5. It's not part of what I need. Okay, so what do I get? 3 times 5 times 5, if you multiply that out, gives you 75. And 75 is divisible by both by both 15 and 25. So there we go. It's a common denominator. All right, I want to do one more of these. So let me clear the board and get you another one. All right, so here's my last example for the factor tree method. 7/40 and 11/30. Again, I'm just looking to try and find a common denominator here. So what do we have? I made factor trees. 40 I split into 2 times 20. Now, there are lots of options for how you split 40. As long as they multiply to be 40, you're okay. You'll get to the same place. So I chose 2 and 20. Now notice, 2, I can't split that up into anything, but I can keep going with 20. I can split that up again. 20 splits into 2 and 10. Again, I'm done with the 2. 10 splits into 2 and 5. All of those are finished. There's nothing else I can split them up into. So now I know that 40 is 3 2s and a single 5. For the 30, we have 2, 3, and 5. When we're done, 30 split into 5 and 6. 6 split into 2 and 3. All right, so 40 is 3 2s and a 5. 30 is 2, 3, and 5. Remember, we want to use the most of each factor that we have. So when I know I'm going to need 2's, 3's, and 5's to make my common denominator. For the 2's, I need 3 of them because 3 is more than 1, so I use 3 2's. For the 3's, there's only 1, right? The 30 has 130, 40 doesn't have any, so I steal the 3. And then for the 5's, a little bit of a trick question, which is more, 1 or 1? They're the same. We don't need them both, we just need 1 because we need the most that either one has. So we get the 5. Oh, and I didn't multiply it out. Shame on me. Let's see. This is 120, I believe. So there we go. That's our common denominator. All right, so these are 3 methods that you can use to find a common denominator. It works with more fractions too, okay? All those methods would work. Yeah, so good luck, and hopefully we'll be ready for addition here very shortly. Thanks.